I found a journal from the 1890's. I hope what's in it isn't true. Written by Realistic Treacle 384. Hey y'all, I'm not really sure if this is the right spot to post this, but I was searching through my grandpa's stuff yesterday when I found this really weird journal thing buried under some old books. I'm not sure if it's a family heirloom or just something that he picked up, but the contents have gotten me a little creeped out. Most of it's normal, just boring talk of life in the Victorian era. But the last entry is a little out there. Keep in mind, it's written in that weird old English that's very hard to read. It's not as bad as you'd think, but it's still pretty dense. So be warned. Hear for yourself. 1897. I apologize for neglecting you all this time, dear companion. But I'm afraid I must confide in you again. For I have witnessed something truly abhorrent on this night. Something that I know no sane man shall believe if I were to reveal it. I had long thought that my father's inheritance would be enough to support me and mother until I concluded my studies and found suitable work. However, in the months following father's death, her health had begun to decline. Her condition burned through the bulk of our savings and forced me to find an alternative source of income, which, given my standing and lack of proper study, proved difficult. For weeks, I paraded myself about the town like a common harlot, begging anyone who would listen for employment. The bobbies nearly tossed me in prison for panhandling the way I went on. But my labor was not without its fruits. I found employ in a man by the name of Count Abraham Hohenzollern. The Count was new to the London area and had taken up residence in a home not too far from Westminster. While the home was full-staffed, the Count had need of an errand boy to undertake the odd deliveries here and there. It was unbecoming work, but it was work nonetheless. I had always had a way with horses, and so figured the job would not be too cumbersome. An assumption proven wrong by the very first day, or should I say night. At nearly the stroke of 3, I was asked to drive one of the Count's carriages to a location that I was not privy to. The time was odd enough before I saw the carriage itself. It was an old contraption that was little more than a box on wheels. There were no seats inside, nor anything meant to accommodate passengers. It was colored a deep black, like that of a starless night sky, and pulled by horses of the same color. A single lantern hung beside the driver's station, though the light seemed to have been sucked into its darkened hide. I could not describe exactly what set me off the vehicle, but now I know all too well. Someone had tried very hard to make sure that it wasn't seen. I was instructed to take the carriage to Abney Park Cemetery, where I would meet 3 of the Count's men. They weren't the most welcoming of individuals, though I suppose nothing more could have been expected given the circumstances. All 3 wore dark clothes and covered their faces with an assortment of cloth and garments. What was the most disturbing of all was the specific work that they undertook. They had gathered outside the cemetery's gates by the time that I arrived and had with them stacks of large leather bags. A pungent odor like that of meat left to rot in the summer sun wafted from the bags and curled my nostrils in disgust. One by one, they loaded the bags into the carriage, during which I could hear their contents jostling about. I figured little from this, and I assumed that I had gotten mixed up with grave robbers of some sort. My good conscience told me to take the carriage straight to the authorities, but the payment was too lucrative to ignore. Doctors cost too much, and my mother wouldn't survive without them. So I did the job, and I did it well. Night in and night out, I would ferry the Count's ill-gotten gains to and from his manor without protest. I could only imagine what use he might have for them. But I imagine that once one has a taste for luxury, it can be quite difficult to relent. He was good for the money as well, more so than I ever thought possible. With the income that I brought in, I was able to pay for whatever personnel or treatment my mother required without having to sacrifice my academic ventures. Before long, she began to recover from her ailments and regain some of the dignity that they had stripped from her. I just say that it was quite reassuring to see her wandering about the house again, sewing and cooking as she had in my earlier years. Greatest of all was her smile. It had been some time since she had mustered anything but a solemn frown or dreary, passive expression. I did not blame her for this, though I could not help but feel resentful towards her. In the months since my father's death, our roles had taken something of a reversal. She, the bedridden, mewling beggar, and I, the stiff-lipped provider. I know in the deepest corner of my heart that it is no fault of her, but I hated her all the same. We had already lost so much dignity in her squalor. The least she could have done was not pout like a common field hand. In the weeks following her recovery, however, she did just that. She greeted me with a grin upon my returns home and sent me off with an equally beaming grin. As time went on, she even rekindled her relations with our neighbors, putting our name back in their good graces. In the few gatherings that I had time to participate in, she was the sun amongst stars, pulling everyone else into her orbit with a twinkling smile and joyous composure. It delighted me to see her in such good spirits again, and made my evening affairs all the more tolerable. Though even my mother's miraculous recovery could not distract me for long. My routine had become almost mundane by this point. I attended classes by day and drove the carriage by night. Nothing more, nothing less. That is, until one night a few weeks ago when my partners in crime made one tiny error. It was a night like so many others. They were filling the carriage with their misbegotten treasures while I sat waiting at the driver's seat. My thoughts lingered on that day's lessons when suddenly a loud crash came barreling through the night. I spun around and saw that one of the workers had thrown one of the bags into the side of the carriage, rather than through the door. An error of exhaustion, no doubt, but one that was not without its consequences. The bag's leathery hide had been split open from the impact, just enough for the dim lantern light to illuminate a tiny sliver of its contents. What I saw shall forever haunt me, for I saw no jewels or coins, but a head. It belonged to that of an older woman whose pale skin had begun to blacken with rot. Her mouth hung a gap devoid of liveliness, and her eyes had rolled back as if she were on the verge of passing out. Silvery strands of hair hung unkempt over her features, robbing her of whatever glow she might have possessed in life. A shocking morbidity hung about the head as it rolled about in the bag. compelling me almost to madness before one of the workers scooped up the bag and tossed it into the carriage. I almost hadn't believed my eyes when the head passed from my vision. Perhaps in another time, I would have thought it a trick my mind had played on me. But the image of the head lingered in my mind with too much clarity. There was a creeping sense of familiarity brought on by the head, and one that will haunt me all through the night. I did my job as I'd been expected to, but all the while battling the haunting nostalgic sight of the head. It wasn't until I returned home that I was greeted with some peace. My mother knew there was something wrong with me. She implored me to talk with one of the many doctors that she saw, but I refused, knowing that my ailment was not physical. All through the day, I was plagued by visions of the head staring back at me. Its aged skin gripped with rot and lifeless eyes turned away from my own. Only when I was in the company of my mother did I find any escape from the waking nightmares. Soon, however, she could offer no more comfort. Grave robbery was a matter I could excuse, but I could not ignore the desecration of corpses. I had to know what sort of man would order such an action and why. With what little free time I had, I endeavored to learn just that. My research proved quite fruitful before long. Count Abraham Hohenzollern was well known in his home country where he had dined with the likes of the Kaiser. He had been born heir to the House of Hohenzollern. He had spent most of his youth cultivating an extensive understanding of the sciences. By age 17, he had graduated from the University of Munich and was heralded in many circles of academia, even here in London, as one of the greatest minds of the modern era. Though what specifically he studied is hard to say. His education was such that he had expertise in practically all realms of knowledge, though he seemed to have something of a leaning to the sciences of life. As you can see, the Count was quite exceptional, but had no inclinations to the depravity that I believed him of. It wasn't until I concluded my research that I found something of that sort. In 1895, a fire had broken out at the Count's ancestral home, Castle Hohenzollern. All of the staff were killed, but the body of Hohenzollern was never found. Strangest of all, eyewitnesses of the event reported seeing a man fleeing from the inferno whilst dragging a sack of something behind him. The local authorities believed this man to have been the culprit, and while I agreed, I did not think that that was the full story. I'm not sure what else I could have uncovered had my investigations persisted. Unfortunately, the Lord had other plans in mind. My mother's health had resumed its decline in the midst of my investigations. Little by little, she inched her way back to bed and soon passed from this world with a smile on her face. She would have been proud of the way it happened and the events that preceded it afterwards. The entire neighborhood came to mourn the loss of her and watch as she was lowered into the earth aside my father. I hold no regrets for her, only that she could have seen how loved she was in the end. Life was hollow for weeks after her passing. The house was left hollow without her presence and the smile that so many had enjoyed. Some days I found myself lingering outside what had been her bedroom, praying that when I stepped inside I would find her laying where she had always been, with rosy cheeks and flashing teeth. I never realized just how much I needed that until she was gone. Time had yet begun to mend such a wound when it was ripped open once again. I returned to my job days after the funeral, only to hear that the Count had ordered a change in the delivery route. Instead of Abney Park, I was instructed to drive to the Brompton Cemetery. I knew the way well. I had buried my mother there only a few days ago. In many ways, the job was exactly the same as it had been. I drove through the night, arrived at the cemetery, and waited while the men loaded their haul into the carriage. All the while, however, I was plagued with thoughts of who had been dug up. I didn't dare look at the bags for fear of which deathly drained face I might have seen staring back at me. Yet, my ignorance was all but futile soil for my dread to grow from. By the time I returned to the manor, I could tolerate no more dread-filled wonderings. I had to know what exactly it was that was transpiring. Making my way to the manor itself was rather simple. I simply stayed out of sight and followed those that had unloaded my carriage cargo inside. When they made their way into the manor, I snuck in behind them without drawing any attention. The inside of the manor marked a stark contrast to the outside. Cool, simple marble work bestowed it with a subtle life, while the inside felt stuffed and dead. Thousands of components compounding together, yet adding nothing. The manor's trappings were regal beyond compare, almost too much so. Every inch of floor was covered in a layer of decorative carpeting. The shapes woven across their faces were so intricate one would get lost in their spiraling patterns and majestic caricatures. It almost hurt to look at, as if the mind could seldom process the sheer magnitude of the designs. The walls departed from this outline very little, being stuffed to the breaking point with exalted items. Swords, shields, guns, portraits, armor, tapestries, anything one could have expected to find in a museum had been strung up against the walls. Some were even stacked atop each other when the owner had run out of room, forming a thick, jaded layer of paraphernalia eclipsing the true wall. The weight of such extensive grandeur was stifling, shortening my breaths ever more as I pressed on. I slunk behind the help, keeping pace with them only as far as I knew where to go next. Their confidence in their security blinded them to my approach and let me follow them to their journey's end. In the center of the manor, or what I believe to be the center, are a set of doors adorned in more jewels and precious stones than the king himself. Had I not known better, I would have thought them the gates to paradise themselves. I could not see behind the doors, for at no point were the staff not moving through them. My chance might have come as they completed their task and wandered off to attend to their other duties, only for the very last one to have locked it shut behind her. I would have snuck my way out of the manor had I not noticed what the servant clutched in her arms. It looked like a slab of meat wrapped up in paper, like the one that one would leave the butcher's shop with. Knowing what had been brought into that room, I elected to follow the servant after all the others had filed away. She climbed the many steps to the top floor of the manor while I crept behind her unheard until she arrived at another peculiar door. This one was not as ornate as the previous ones, but if I had to summarize its peculiarity, the rest of the house seemed to have grown from it like roots from a tree. Rings of items spread out from the door, carrying with them some semblance of uniformity. The closer one drew to the door, the less and less clutter covered the walls, giving one a view of the oddly uneven brickwork beneath. Countless stones of varying shapes, sizes, and hues had been sealed together with mortar that dripped over them. The patchwork was unbecoming of such a luxurious establishment and unnerved me as I approached. The servant undid the lock on the door and gently pushed it open. A vigorous beam of light came bursting into the hallway, blinding me in its contrast between the dim halls. The servant slipped inside before long, and I crept to catch the door before it shut. I did not slip inside after her, electing to instead linger by the door and peer through the crack the light streamed from. Inside was a place I assumed was a dressing room of sorts, albeit one that had been expanded to its zenith. The ceiling easily rose another story, with the oddly barren walls colored a white as pure as snow. A chandelier hung over the room, from which flickering candlelight was cast outwards in every direction. Shadows danced across the floor, which was covered in an assortment of papers scattered haphazardly across it. I could make out little of what was transcribed on them, but what I could discern seemed to be anatomical diagrams of the human body. I even recognized a few of them from my university's medical studies. In the very back of the room, however, lay that which drew all my attention. A dressing table was propped against the back wall, but it was not adorned with beautification products like my mother's had been. Rather, the only items it housed were string and needles, as if he were preparing to quilt something together. Sitting before the odd display was a figure whose details I could not ascertain. His body was covered in a silken robe that glistened in the candlelight. His face was obscured by a hood that he had pulled over his head. His back faced the doorway from which I spied, and the servant approached, making further identification impossible. The woman was in clear distress as she approached. Her posture became rigid like stone, and her steps slowed the closer she drew to our mutual benefactor. I can only imagine what horror contorted her expressions. She was quick to lay the package down on the dressing table, scurry back, and say, "The portion you requested, my gracious lord." The figure's head turned ever so slightly to gaze at the parchment and asked in a voice tatted and mangled like shattered glass, "Not too old, I hope?" "Yes, my gracious lord. The specimen was 54 when she died," the servant answered. The man slowly extended a hand out to rest on the parchment, a simple act that elicited a surge of horror within me. The hand that slipped from his robe was a patchwork of color of every shade on God's green earth. White, black, and yellow, all sewn together with thread into a quilt of human skin. The fingers themselves were also mismatched. Some were withered like that of an elder. Others were thick and callous-laced, and one was so small and frail that I swear it must have belonged to a child. I had clasped my hand over my mouth to suppress the gasp that would have escaped. My eyes could not turn away from the sight nor stop themselves from absorbing every detail of the scene. They raced along, every string laced through that skin, only to watch them disappear into the folds of the robes. I should have fled from the sight as any sane man would. But a fierce union of fear and morbid curiosity froze me to the spot. The mismatched hand pulled the package in front of the figure, obscuring it from my view. "Good," the man moaned, as if he were spitting out his last words before suddenly barking, "Leave!" As if a dog from the starting line, the woman burst from the spot and fled back to the door. Her rush was such that I barely had time to dodge aside, and when she did come barreling through the doors, she did not notice me crouching beside the door before speeding off down the stairs. I assume she was too desperate to flee from the man to notice someone slinking in the shadows. I should have fled then and there. But I had only found more questions instead of answers. Against all better judgments, I stayed at the door and kept my eyes trained on the figure inside. I heard the tearing off the parcel before I spied his ill-assorted hands snatching up needle and thread from the table. A terrible sound rang through the room, like the tearing of wet meat as I saw the hands fiddle with the parcel's contents. Spurts of dark fluid sprayed out across the table, along with tiny bits of some strange solid matter whose origin I still refuse to contemplate. Despite the gruesome connotations, I was not deterred. If anything, I was drawn in by the display, or lack thereof. I had to know what depraved madness was being performed in that infernal place, and more importantly, what it was being performed on. My questions compounded with every second that I remained, and I slowly crept into the room, straining to see what work the figure was conducting. Soon, however, the figure stopped their fumbling and looked straight into the mirror. Every atom of air froze as the man turned his head from side to side. "Beautiful," he muttered like a sculptor inspecting his masterpiece. I couldn't wait a moment longer. I had to know what was going on, even to the death of me. As it turns out, that wasn't hyperbole. In my ravenous curiosity, I leaned into the room just too much, and I outright lost my balance. I regained it quite easily, but I had to slam a foot down in order to do so, which then sent a thunderous echo racing through the room. My heart stopped dead in its tracks at that moment, as if suddenly the whole world had turned its eyes to me. In an instant, the figure spun in its seat and showed me the most gut-wrenching sight I will ever see. I had hoped merely to see a patchwork face staring back at me. But instead, what I saw was that of my mother gazing across the room, with that jubilant grin beaming back at me. Lining her face was a ring of stitchwork securing it in place, connected to a needle in the figure's hand by a bloody thread. Do not mistake what I say. It was not merely an elderly woman's face. It was my mother's. I could never mistake that smile. In an instant, however, such a jovial feature twisted into an expression of the purest rage man could hope to produce. That face which I had loved and admired for so long flung every ounce of spite it could at me in a way I can only recall in my nightmares. The figure snapped to their feet, jabbing the needle in my direction with a mismatched hand, and howled, "Get out! Get out! I'm not ready! Get out!" I complied in an instant, fleeing from the spot with the ferocity of a true coward. I tore down the stairs, bashing through every staff member that thought of stopping me, and I burst out into the night. I was chased all the while by the thought of what I had seen. I haven't left my home since. I dare not disclose my findings, for even I do not believe them. I have prayed for madness every night if it means that what I have seen was not real. But the memory only falls into greater clarity with each passing day. My thoughts are plagued with questions that I have been left with. I wonder what I even saw that night. Perhaps it was the count in question, though I pray that that is not the truth. I cannot imagine a world where a man would subject himself to such disfiguration. But what else could it be? Whatever that abomination is, its words have plagued me above all else. I fear what might happen when it is ready, or even what ready may look like for that demon. A part of me does not dare to imagine what beastly creation could be birthed from such an outcome. Yet another theory haunts me even more. I saw what that creature had done to itself. The parts that it had stitched to itself. Mangled as they were human nonetheless. I fear that that is its end goal. To be human enough to walk invisible amongst our ranks, and for what reason I cannot say, nor do I wish to know. I only dread the day when such a demon is allowed to tread where it wishes and do as it pleases. When it is no longer satiated by the dead alone.